The air in the courtroom was so cold it felt like it could shatter. Before the Honorable Judge Maria Hernandez sat billionaire William Beaumont, a titan of industry whose smile could charm senators and whose wrath could bankrupt nations. Beside him, his lawyer Vincent Adler looked like a predator that had already tasted blood. And then there was Jessica, his wife. In a simple grey dress, she looked like a ghost at her own funeral, a woman about to be erased. The judge picked up her pen, the final instrument of Jessica's demise. The settlement was a pittance, a mockery of their 20 years together. The end was here. But just as the nib of the pen was about to meet the paper, Jessica's lawyer stood. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "my client has one final piece of evidence." The silence that followed the objection from Jessica Beaumont's lawyer, Rebecca Finch, was profound. It was the kind of silence that precedes either a spectacular victory or a humiliating defeat, and in the opulent wood-paneled courtroom of the New York County Supreme Court, everyone assumed it would be the latter. William Beaumont, founder and CEO of the tech behemoth Nexus Dynamics, didn't even flinch. He sat with an air of bored indifference, his custom-tailored suit a silent testament to a wealth so vast it bent reality around him. He shifted his weight, a subtle movement that conveyed immense impatience, and shot a look at his own legal counsel, the notoriously ruthless Vincent Adler. Adler, a man whose face seemed permanently set in a condescending smirk, simply shook his head, a gesture meant to dismiss Rebecca Finch as one might wave away a fly. "Your Honor," Adler began, his voice smooth and deep, resonating with years of courtroom dominance. "Ms. Finch is stalling. We have spent 3 days establishing the facts. The prenuptial agreement signed by both parties on May 12, 2005, is ironclad. It stipulates a one-time payment of $1 million upon dissolution of the marriage, plus the deed to the upstate cottage. My client, in his immense generosity, has offered $5 million plus the cottage. Mrs. Beaumont is entitled to nothing more." Judge Maria Hernandez peered down from her bench, her expression unreadable. She was a veteran of these bitter, high-stakes divorces, where love was a forgotten currency, and marriage was reduced to a hostile takeover. She'd seen men like William Beaumont, before powerful, arrogant, and utterly convinced of their own invincibility. She'd also seen women like Jessica, worn down, intimidated, and ultimately broken by the legal machinery their husbands could afford. "Ms. Finch," the judge said, her voice sharp, cutting through the tension. "This evidence you speak of, is it pertinent? We are not here to relitigate the terms of an unambiguous legal document." Rebecca Finch, a young lawyer whose earnestness seemed out of place in such a cynical arena, clutched a simple manila folder to her chest. "It is, Your Honor. It is the most pertinent piece of evidence in this entire proceeding." William laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, but a short, derisive huff that echoed in the cavernous room. "Let me guess," he said, addressing the judge directly, a breach of protocol he knew he could get away with. "Jessica found a love letter I wrote her in college. A restaurant napkin where I promised her the world. It's touching, really, but it's not a contract." Jessica, who had remained statue still until this point, finally looked up. Her eyes, shadowed with exhaustion, found her husband's. There was no hatred in them, only a profound and weary sadness. For 20 years she had been his shadow, his support, the silent partner in his meteoric rise. She had hosted the dinners, charmed the investors, raised their 2 children, and managed the sprawling estates while he built his empire. She had been the bedrock upon which Nexus Dynamics was indirectly built, and now he was treating her like a redundant employee being offered a meager severance package. Mr. Adler, Judge Hernandez said, her gaze firm on the lawyer. "Control your client." To Rebecca, she said, "Present your evidence." Rebecca Finch walked forward, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. She didn't approach Adler. Instead, she walked directly to the clerk's table and placed the manila folder down. "Your Honor, Mr. Adler is correct that my client signed a prenuptial agreement on May 12, 2005. The document he has presented to the court is indeed that agreement." Adler's smirk widened. "Then I fail to see the issue." "The issue, Your Honor, Rebecca," said her voice gaining strength, "is that my client has in her possession another prenuptial agreement, one that Mr. Beaumont also signed." A ripple of confusion went through the courtroom. Adler's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "Objection? That's absurd. Is she claiming forgery?" "We have the notarized, legally binding document right here." "I am not claiming forgery, Your Honor," Rebecca replied, looking directly at the judge. "I am claiming that the document Mr. Adler possesses is a replacement, a fraudulent substitute for the original agreement signed by my client and Mr. Beaumont 3 months prior to their wedding." William Beaumont finally sat up straight. The bored indifference was gone, replaced by a cold, dangerous stillness. He stared at Jessica, a silent question in his eyes. "What are you doing?" Jessica met his gaze, and for the first time in a decade, she didn't look away. "Ms. Finch," the judge warned, "these are serious allegations. You had better be able to substantiate them." Rebecca nodded. She opened the manila folder. Inside was not a thick, professionally bound document like the one Adler had. It was a single folded sheet of what looked like simple stationery, yellowed with age. "This," she announced, her voice ringing with newfound confidence, "is the real prenup. Signed by William Beaumont and Jessica Peterson on February 14, 2005. She slid it across the table. "And unlike Mr. Adler's version, this one contains a partnership clause." The air crackled. Vincent Adler was on his feet, his face a mask of outrage. "This is a circus, a desperate last-ditch attempt to extort money with a fabricated document." But Judge Hernandez wasn't looking at Adler. Her eyes were fixed on the single sheet of paper. And then she looked at William Beaumont, whose face had gone unnervingly pale. The Titan was starting to tremble. February 14, 2005. It wasn't a day of champagne and diamonds. It was a day of takeout pizza and cheap red wine in a cramped 4th-floor walk-up apartment in Palo Alto. The air was thick with the smell of old books and the buzzing energy of 2 people in their early 20s, utterly in love, and convinced they were on the cusp of changing the world. William Beaumont was not yet a billionaire. He was a brilliant obsessive coder with a revolutionary idea for data compression algorithms. His company then just a name. Nexus Dynamics existed only on a whiteboard in their living room, and in the lines of code he typed feverishly into the night. He was fueled by caffeine ambition and the unwavering belief of the woman sitting across from him. Jessica Peterson was a freelance graphic designer with a keen eye and an intuitive understanding of branding. She was the one who took Will's chaotic genius and gave it a face. She designed the now iconic Nexus logo, a simple, elegant intersecting loop on a battered laptop at their shared kitchen table. She created their first pitch decks, coached Will on how to speak to investors without sounding like a rambling mad scientist, and used her own modest savings to keep them afloat when his seed funding was running low. She wasn't his employee. She was his partner in every sense of the word. That Valentine's night surrounded by pizza boxes, Will had grown quiet. He'd been burned before in a college relationship, a messy breakup that had left him with a deep-seated fear of vulnerability. He'd started nervously turning a wine cork over in his fingers. "We need to talk about a prenup." Jessica had laughed. A prenup will we have about $5,000 in the bank and a mountain of student debt. What are we protecting your collection of vintage Star Wars figures? I'm serious, he said, his gaze intense. This Nexus, it's going to be big. I know it. And if it is, I need to protect it. I need to know it's secure. The implication stung. You think I'm going to come after your company? No, of course not, he'd said, reaching across the table to take her hands. His were warm, calloused from hours on the keyboard. It's just business, a formality. I trust you more than anyone on the planet. But the investors, the lawyers, they'll want to see that everything is clean. It protects us both. Jessica, deeply in love and willing to do anything to quell his anxieties, had agreed. But she had a condition. Okay, she said. But if we're going to do this, we're going to do it our way. Right now. She'd grabbed a piece of her personal letterhead, thick cream-colored paper, with her initials embossed at the top. She took a pen and began to write. It wasn't a document filled with legalese. It was a statement of their partnership. It stipulated that all personal assets owned prior to the marriage would remain separate. Standard stuff. But then she added the clause that would 2 decades later detonate in a New York courtroom. The partnership clause. It stated in her clear cursive handwriting that Nexus Dynamics was a joint venture. It acknowledged her foundational work on the company's branding, marketing strategy, and initial operational support. It specified that should the marriage end while all future wealth accumulated by William would be, his Jessica would be entitled to a one-time payment equivalent to 50% of the company's first official valuation post-Series A funding. This way, she'd explained, it honors what we're building now together. Before it becomes some giant, faceless corporation, it protects my contribution to the foundation. Everything after that is all you. It's fair. Will had read it over. A valuation based on the seed stage, not the billions it might one day be worth. It seemed more than fair. It seemed insignificant compared to the future he envisioned. It was a romantic gesture, a way to codify their partnership on paper. It was their contract written on their terms. He'd smiled the brilliant, unguarded smile she hadn't seen in years. Fair enough, partner. He took the pen and signed his name at the bottom with a flourish, William D. Beaumont. His signature was less polished than more of a youthful scrawl. She signed hers, Jessica M. Peterson, below his. They didn't have a notary. Their witness was the blinking cursor on his computer screen and the city lights of Palo Alto twinkling outside their window. They folded the paper, put it in an envelope, and tucked it away in a small fireproof box with her birth certificate and their college diplomas. It was their secret, their real promise. 3 months later, just before the wedding, Will's first major investor came through. With the money came lawyers. Men like a young Vincent Adler who insisted on a proper prenuptial agreement. He'd presented Jessica with a thick, intimidating document full of dense legal jargon. It's just a formality, Jess Will had told her, echoing his words from Valentine's Day, but his tone was different now. More distant. More business-like. Adler says this is the standard. It protects the company. It's for the investors. She'd flicked through the pages. The legalese was impenetrable, but she saw the numbers. A $1 million payout. It seemed abstract, almost meaningless. She was about to marry the man she loved. She wasn't planning for a divorce. She'd been so caught up in the wedding planning and the excitement of their new funding that she hadn't paid it much attention. She remembered their handwritten agreement, safe in its box, and assumed this corporate document was just a supplement to it, a piece of paper for the suits. Trusting Will, she signed where Adler pointed. She never knew that Will, on Adler's advice, had taken their original handwritten agreement from the box and replaced it with a copy of the new one. The original Adler had warned was a liability, a sentimental landmine. It needed to disappear. But Will Beaumont, for all his future ruthlessness, had made one critical sentimental error. He couldn't bring himself to destroy it. He couldn't burn the last tangible proof of the man he used to be and the woman who had built him. He'd hidden it away, burying it deep within a box of old college memorabilia, convinced it would never see the light of day. He had forgotten one crucial thing: he was married to the most organized, meticulous person he had ever known. The first $1 billion changed William Beaumont. The man Jessica had married, the passionate, slightly awkward genius who would rather spend a weekend coding than at a cocktail party, was slowly lacquered over by a new persona, the powerful, untouchable tech mogul. The change wasn't sudden. It was a gradual erosion. It started with small things. He stopped calling her partner. He started referring to Nexus Dynamics as my company. When an article in a business magazine credited her with designing the famous logo, he'd been furious, claiming his marketing department had refined a concept. He moved her out of any and all business discussions, framing it as a kindness. "You don't need to worry your pretty head about board meetings and shareholder reports," he'd say, patting her hand. "I'll take care of everything." Jessica, busy raising their 2 children, Matthew and Sophie, initially accepted it. She told herself he was protecting her from stress. But as the years went on, the distance grew into a chasm. Their conversations became transactional, revolving around school schedules, charity galas, and which Hamptons property they would use for the summer. The shared dreams of their tiny Palo Alto apartment were a forgotten language. He became a man obsessed with legacy and image. He bought yachts, private jets, and art he didn't understand. He surrounded himself with sycophants who laughed at his jokes and never challenged his opinions. And he began to treat Jessica not as his wife, but as his most valuable and most controlled asset. He dictated her wardrobe, her friends, even her charitable activities. She was Mrs. Beaumont, a perfect accessory to his perfect life. The final irrevocable break came with Kendra Michaels. Kendra was everything Jessica wasn't. She was 24, a raven-haired model and influencer, whose ambition was as sharp and cold as polished steel. She was a creature of the world. Will now inhabited a world of flashbulbs, exclusive parties, and transactional relationships. Will didn't try to hide the affair. He flaunted it. He was photographed with Kendra on his yacht in St. Bart's, dining with her in Paris, sitting beside her at fashion shows. It was a public and brutal humiliation. He was communicating to the world and to Jessica that she was being replaced by a newer, shinier model. When Jessica finally confronted him, her voice shaking with a pain that had been building for years, his response was chillingly indifferent. "Don't be so dramatic, Jessica," he'd said, not even looking up from his tablet. "These things happen. We have a good arrangement. You have a beautiful life. The children are provided for. Don't ruin it by being hysterical." That was the moment the love finally died. It was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She wasn't going to be provided for. She wasn't going to be discarded like an old piece of hardware. She had helped build the empire that was now being used to humiliate her. She contacted Rebecca Finch, not a high-powered divorce attorney from a major firm, but a recommendation from an old college friend. Rebecca was young, hungry, and specialized in intellectual property, not matrimonial law. But Jessica wasn't just litigating a marriage. She was reclaiming a legacy. She felt Rebecca would understand. In their first meeting, Jessica laid out the whole story from the Palo Alto apartment to the public affair. When she got to the part about the 2 prenups, Rebecca's eyes lit up. "Do you have it?" "The original?" Rebecca had asked, leaning forward. "No," Jessica admitted, her heart sinking. "I looked everywhere. In the old fireproof box, there was just a copy of the corporate one. He must have destroyed it." For weeks it seemed like a dead end. They were forced to fight on the battlefield Will and Adler had created, centered around the ironclad corporate prenup. The $5 million offer was a slap in the face. Nexus Dynamics was now valued at over $30 billion. The first Series A valuation, the one mentioned in her handwritten prenup, had been a mere $80 million. 50% of that was $40 million. It wasn't about the money for Jessica. It was the principle. It was the acknowledgement of her contribution. The divorce proceedings were brutal. Adler painted her as a greedy, vindictive woman who had contributed nothing but spending her husband's money. He produced receipts from designer boutiques, travel agencies, and decorators, weaving a narrative of a pampered trophy wife. Desperate, Jessica decided to pack up the last of her personal belongings from the cavernous Fifth Avenue penthouse she had once called home. The staff, now reporting directly to William, treated her like an intruder. In the back of a deep storage closet, behind dusty ski equipment and forgotten luggage, was a sealed box labeled WB, College Mementos. Will had always been fanatically private about it. Driven by a flicker of intuition, she pried it open. Inside were old textbooks, faded photographs, a dried corsage, and at the very bottom, tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of The Wealth of Nations, was a familiar cream-colored envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it. There it was. The single sheet of her old stationery yellowed with age, her own handwriting outlining the partnership clause. And at the bottom, his signature, not the confident, powerful slash of the billionaire, but the hopeful, slightly messy scrawl of the boy she had fallen in love with. He hadn't destroyed it. Some small, buried part of him couldn't let it go. She immediately called Rebecca. "I have it," she'd whispered into the phone, tears of vindication streaming down her face. "I have the real prenup." But that wasn't all she had. The confrontation with Will had sparked something else in her, a suspicion. For years she had handled the family's personal finances and philanthropic efforts. She knew Will's spending habits, his investments, his obsessive attention to detail. The way he was so eager to push for a quick divorce and a relatively small settlement felt wrong. It felt too easy. He wasn't a man who left money on the table even for a generous offer. On a hunch, she had hired a private investigator, a grizzled ex-NYPD detective named Frank Miller. She didn't ask him to dig for more dirt on the affair. That was public knowledge. She gave him a different task. "I want you to look into Nexus Dynamics financials," she'd told him. "Specifically any new shell corporations or offshore accounts opened in the last 2 years. He's hiding something. I don't think it's just about the divorce. It's bigger." Frank Miller had called her the night before the final court date. "Mrs. Beaumont," he'd said, his voice grim. "You were right. It's much bigger. Your husband isn't just cheating on you. He's cheating everyone." Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had transformed. The board resignation had evaporated, replaced by a crackling, high-stakes tension. Judge Hernandez held the single yellowed sheet of paper, her expression one of intense concentration. "Mr. Beaumont," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Is this your signature?" William Beaumont's face was a marble mask of controlled fury. "It looks like my signature from 20 years ago, yes. That doesn't make this document legitimate. It's a relic, a piece of sentimental nonsense Jessica and I wrote one night. It was superseded by a legally binding, notarized contract. This is a desperate theatrical ploy. Vincent Adler, recovering his composure, moved to his client's side. Your Honor, my client has already attested to the fact that this piece of paper exists. It was a romantic gesture, nothing more. It has no legal standing. To suggest it invalidates a multi-million-dollar contract drafted by a team of legal professionals is frankly laughable. Rebecca Finch stood her ground. It is not laughable, Your Honor. It is a contract signed by both parties with clear terms. The fact that it was not notarized does not invalidate it, especially given the context. More importantly, we contend that my client was fraudulently induced into signing the second agreement under the pretense that it was merely a formality for the investors, when in fact its primary purpose was to nullify this original, fairer agreement and strip her of her foundational stake in Nexus Dynamics. Fraud Adler thundered, his voice dripping with theatrical outrage. That is a slanderous and unsubstantiated accusation. Where is your proof of this so-called inducement? This was the moment. The pivot. Jessica looked at Rebecca and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The proof, Rebecca said, turning her attention from the prenup to the judge, is in Mr. Beaumont's pattern of behavior. A pattern of deception and concealment that extends far beyond his marriage. Adler threw his hands up in exasperation. Objection. This is a divorce, proceeding not a business audit. Ms. Finch is trying to muddy the waters with irrelevant and slanderous accusations about my client's company. I believe it is highly relevant, Your Honor. Rebecca pressed on her voice, steady. As it demonstrates intent. The intent to deceive my client is part of a much larger pattern of financial fraud. The words hung in the air, deadly and deliberate. Financial fraud. The term landed like a grenade in the sterile courtroom. William Beaumont, who had been leaning forward to whisper angrily to Adler, froze. The color drained from his face. This was not part of the script. Judge Hernandez's eyes narrowed. She was no longer just a divorce judge. She was a guardian of the law, and she smelled something rotten. Ms. Finch, you are on thin ice. Make your point. Now. For the past 2 years, Rebecca began her voice, clear and precise. While Mr. Beaumont was planning this divorce, he has been systematically and illegally devaluing Nexus Dynamics on paper. He has been funneling millions of dollars through a series of newly created unregistered shell corporations based in the Cayman Islands and Panama. She pulled another file from her briefcase. This one was thick and heavy. We have records, wire transfers, incorporation documents for entities like Apex Holdings Group and Viridian Global Solutions, all dummy corporations that trace back to a single secret account controlled by Mr. Beaumont. He has been using these to award fake consulting contracts and purchase phantom assets, effectively siphoning profits from Nexus Dynamics before they can be reported to shareholders or to the court. Adler was speechless. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. This was a catastrophic blind side. This went far beyond the scope of their divorce strategy. He was a divorce lawyer, a shark in marital disputes, not a white-collar criminal defense attorney. The purpose of this scheme was twofold. Rebecca continued her confidence soaring. First, to hide assets from this court to reduce his divorce liability. He wanted to appear less liquid to make his generous $5 million offer seem more reasonable. But more significantly, he was preparing to cheat his own shareholders and the IRS out of hundreds of millions of dollars. The man who claims my client is a greedy gold digger is in fact perpetrating a massive corporate fraud. She placed the thick file on the clerk's table next to the single handwritten prenup. The 2 pieces of evidence, one from the past and one from the present, told a single devastating story of a man's corruption. Judge Hernandez stared at the new file. The implications were staggering. This was no longer just a messy divorce. It had the potential to become one of the biggest corporate scandals of the decade. She looked at William Beaumont, who was now visibly sweating. The mask of power had shattered, revealing a cornered, desperate man. "Your Honor," Adler finally stammered, "these are outrageous and unproven fantasies. My client is one of the most respected business leaders in the world. Then he won't mind if we verify the signature on this original agreement." Judge Hernandez said, her voice like ice. She held up the yellowed paper. "I am ordering a recess. During this time, a court-appointed forensic document examiner will analyze this signature against known examples of Mr. Beaumont's signature from that period. Furthermore, I am ordering Mr. Beaumont and his legal team to remain in this courthouse. No one leaves." She banged her gavel, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Recess." As the judge swept from the room, a frantic energy erupted. Reporters in the gallery were already scrambling for their phones. Vincent Adler was furiously whispering to a stone-faced William Beaumont. But Jessica just sat there, breathing slowly. For the first time in days, the crushing weight on her chest had begun to lift. The battle was far from over, but she had done more than just present a piece of evidence. She had changed the entire battlefield. She wasn't just fighting for a fair settlement anymore. She was fighting for the truth. The 2-hour recess felt like an eternity. William and his lawyer were sequestered in a witness room, the sounds of their heated, panicked arguments muffled by the thick oak door. Jessica and Rebecca sat in a small, sterile conference room, the silence between them filled with a fragile, burgeoning hope. "The handwriting expert is our first hurdle," Rebecca said, pacing the floor. "Adler will try to discredit them, claim the ink is wrong. The paper is aged artificially." "It's real," Jessica said, her voice quiet but firm. "I watched him sign it. I know his hand. It's real." Her mind wasn't on the signature. It was on the other file, the one detailing the web of deceit Frank Miller had uncovered. Miller had been meticulous. He'd found a disgruntled junior accountant at one of the offshore firms who promised anonymity, and legal protection had been willing to leak the initial wire transfer records. From that one loose thread, Miller had unraveled the whole rotten tapestry. It was a classic fraud scheme, overinflating expenses, paying invoices to phantom companies, and parking the illicit cash in untraceable accounts. Will was stealing from his own company. The call finally came. Judge Hernandez was reconvening the court. As they filed back into the courtroom, the change in atmosphere was palpable. The smug confidence had completely drained from William Beaumont's side of the room. He looked older, his face gaunt and ashen. Vincent Adler's usual predatory swagger had been replaced by a stiff, defensive posture. He looked like a man who knew he was captaining a sinking ship. Judge Hernandez entered and took her seat, her face grim. She wasted no time on pleasantries. "I have the preliminary report from the forensic examiner," she announced, her voice echoing in the silent room. The analysis compared the signature on the document dated February 14th, 2005, with Mr. Beaumont's signature on his student loan applications from 2003, his original driver's license application from 2002, and personal correspondence from that era provided by Ms. Finch. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. William Beaumont stared at her. His jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle jumped in his cheek. "The conclusion is unequivocal," the judge declared. "The penmanship pressure stroke and stylistic elements are a definitive match. There is no doubt that the signature on this document belongs to Mr. William Beaumont." A collective gasp went through the gallery. Rebecca Finch squeezed Jessica's hand under the table. It was the first domino. Adler leaped to his feet. Your Honor, even if the signature is authentic, our position remains unchanged. It's a superseded document, emotionally charged but legally irrelevant. Judge Hernandez silenced him with a glare. Mr. Adler, your position is the least of your client's concerns right now. The authenticity of this document lends significant credence to Ms. Finch's claim of fraudulent inducement. It establishes that a prior, vastly different agreement existed, one that your client actively concealed from his wife when he had her sign your firm's version. She then picked up the thick file of financial documents, which brings me to this. Her gaze shifted to William. It was no longer the look of a divorce judge, but that of a federal prosecutor. The allegations presented by Ms. Finch are of the most serious nature. They suggest a conspiracy to commit wire fraud, securities fraud, and tax evasion. These are not matters for a family court. She looked towards the court officer. Bailiff, please inform the district attorney's office that I am referring this case for immediate criminal investigation. I am also forwarding this evidence to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service. If the signature confirmation was a domino, this was an earthquake. William Beaumont physically recoiled as if he'd been struck. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly white. His entire empire, his reputation, his very freedom, it was all collapsing in a matter of minutes. He was no longer a titan of industry in a messy divorce. He was a potential federal inmate. Vincent Adler, for the first time in his career, was utterly lost. He opened his mouth, but the objections died on his lips. What could he say? His client's personal and corporate worlds were simultaneously imploding. Given these extraordinary circumstances, Judge Hernandez continued, her voice ringing with authority. This court finds that the prenuptial agreement dated May 12, 2005, presented by Mr. Beaumont, was executed under fraudulent pretenses. It is hereby declared null and void. She held up the single yellowed sheet of paper. This court upholds the original agreement, dated February 14, 2005, as the binding contract governing the dissolution of this marriage. Per the terms of its partnership clause, Mrs. Beaumont is awarded 50% of Nexus Dynamics' first official valuation post-Series A funding. The clerk who had already done the math provided the figure. That valuation was $80 million, Your Honor. Then the settlement is for $40 million, the judge declared. She looked down at Jessica, a flicker of something respect, perhaps, in her eyes. Furthermore, given Mr. Beaumont's blatant attempts to conceal assets and defraud this court, I am awarding all legal fees to be paid by him. A temporary freeze is being placed on all known personal and corporate assets, pending the federal investigations. She banged the gavel. The sound was final. It was the death knell of William Beaumont's world. As the judge exited the room, erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions. William sat paralyzed, staring into the abyss that had just opened up before him. His girlfriend, Kendra Michaels, who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom for moral support, slipped out a side door, vanishing from his life as quickly as she had entered it. Vincent Adler leaned over to his client. "Will we need to?" But William wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on Jessica. He saw her stand up, her shoulders straight, her face calm. She wasn't smirking. She wasn't gloating. She simply held his gaze for a long moment, and in her eyes he saw not a victorious ex-wife, but the ghost of the woman from that Palo Alto apartment, the partner he had betrayed, the architect of his success, whose name he had tried to erase from history. And in that moment, he understood. He hadn't just lost $40 million. He hadn't just lost his company and his freedom. He had lost the one person who had believed in him before he was worth anything at all, and it had cost him everything. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The story of the billionaire's secret prenup was a media supernova. News vans camped outside the courthouse and the headquarters of Nexus Dynamics. The company's stock, already reeling from market volatility, went into a complete freefall. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting, and within 24 hours, William Beaumont was forced to step down as CEO. He was stripped of the title he had built his entire identity around becoming a pariah overnight. The federal investigations were swift and merciless. The documents Frank Miller had uncovered were the tip of a massive iceberg. The district attorney's office, the SEC, and the IRS descended upon Nexus Dynamics like a pack of wolves armed with subpoenas and search warrants. They froze accounts, seized servers, and interviewed dozens of employees. What they found was a culture of financial deception that went even deeper than Jessica had suspected, orchestrated from the very top. William wasn't just hiding money from his wife. He was running his multi-billion-dollar corporation like a personal piggy bank. Vincent Adler, desperate to save his own reputation from the sinking wreckage of his client, tried to negotiate a plea bargain. But the evidence was overwhelming. The government wasn't interested in a deal. They wanted to make an example of William Beaumont, the arrogant tech titan who thought he was above the law. Indictments were handed down not just for fraud and tax evasion, but for obstruction of justice after it was discovered that Will had ordered a subordinate to wipe specific servers the night after the judge's ruling. While her husband's world crumbled, Jessica retreated from the spotlight. She refused all interview requests and instructed Rebecca to handle the media inquiries. She wasn't interested in a victory tour. The $40 million settlement was transferred to her account, but it felt secondary to the real victory. It was the judge's words upholding their original agreement that mattered most. It was a legal acknowledgement of her role as a founder, a partner. Her name was finally officially etched back into the history of Nexus Dynamics. She moved out of the city, taking her 2 teenage children, Matthew and Sophie, to the upstate cottage that had been part of even the fraudulent settlement offer. It was a quiet, unassuming place on a lake, a world away from the toxic glamour of their Manhattan life. The children were confused and hurt, their image of their father shattered. Jessica spent her days helping them navigate the complex emotions of loving a man who had done terrible things. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a month after the verdict, she was sitting on the porch when a package arrived. It was from her lawyer's office, but the contents were personal. It was the original handwritten prenup, now sealed in a protective sleeve, returned to her after being used as evidence. She took the single sheet of paper out and smoothed it on the table. The paper was fragile, the ink slightly faded. She ran her finger over his signature, the hopeful scrawl of the young man she had loved. She felt a pang of sadness, not for the man he had become, but for the man he had failed to be. They had stood at the dawn of something incredible, 2 partners against the world. He had chosen greed and ego, and in doing so had destroyed not only their love, but himself. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from an old friend from her graphic design days, Olivia. "Jess, I saw the news. Are you okay? Just wanted to say. I always knew you designed that logo. We all did. Welcome back." Tears welled in Jessica's eyes. It was a simple message, but it meant more than the $40 million in her bank account. It was a restoration. For 2 decades, she had been Mrs. Beaumont, a reflection of her husband's success. Now she was Jessica Peterson again, the designer, the partner, the co-founder. A few weeks later, another call came. It was from a group of senior executives at Nexus Dynamics, the ones who were trying to salvage the company from the wreckage Will had left behind. They had ousted the old guard and were trying to rebuild trust with their employees and shareholders. "Mrs. Beaumont," Jessica, the interim CEO, said, his voice hesitant. We know this is unorthodox. But we were looking through the early archives of the company, the original pitch decks, the first branding guides. Your work, it was brilliant. It was the soul of the company, something we've lost along the way. We want to ask, would you consider coming on board as a consultant? To help us find our way back, Jessica looked out at the calm lake, the afternoon sun glinting on the water. It was a crossroads she never imagined. She could take her money and live a quiet, comfortable life, far from the world that had caused her so much pain. Or she could step back into the arena, not as a wife or a shadow, but as herself on her own terms. She could help rebuild the company she had helped create this time, ensuring its foundation was built on integrity, not deceit. A small smile touched her lips for the first time in months. It wasn't the smile of a woman who had won a war, but of a woman who had survived one and rediscovered her own strength. "Tell me more," she said. 2 years later, the name William Beaumont was a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and business schools. After a lengthy trial, he was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. His appeals were denied. Stripped of his wealth, his company, and his freedom, he was a ghost of the man who had once commanded the world from a Manhattan skyscraper. The few photos that emerged showed a grey, hollowed-out man in a prison jumpsuit, the arrogance finally extinguished from his eyes. Nexus Dynamics, however, had survived. Against all odds, it had pulled back from the brink of collapse. The journey had been arduous. The company had to pay hundreds of millions in fines to the SEC and back taxes to the IRS, but under new leadership, it had stabilized. And a key part of that new leadership was Jessica Peterson. She had accepted the consulting role, and her impact was immediate and profound. She didn't concern herself with the technical side of the business. She focused on its identity, its culture, its soul. She spearheaded a company-wide rebranding initiative called the Nexus Project. It wasn't just about a new logo or a new color palette. It was about transparency and ethics. She instituted a new corporate governance charter, championed a foundation to promote women in tech, and became the moral compass the company had so desperately needed. She never took an executive title, preferring to remain a senior advisor to the board. She didn't want power. She wanted influence. She worked not from the gleaming corporate headquarters, but mostly from her upstate home, finding a balance between her work and her life with her children that she had never been allowed before. The $40 million settlement was no longer just a number in her bank account. It was capital. She used it to launch her own venture capital fund, Peterson Partners, with a singular mission to invest in startups, founded or co-founded by women. She became a mentor to a new generation of entrepreneurs, sharing not only her business acumen, but also the hard-won wisdom of her own story. She taught them to read every contract, to trust their instincts, and above all, to never ever let anyone else take credit for their work. On the 5th anniversary of the verdict, a young journalist from a major tech publication secured a rare interview with her. They met at a small cafe in the city, far from the prying eyes of the financial district. "People see your story as one of revenge," the journalist said. "The wronged wife who took down a titan." Jessica took a sip of her coffee, her expression thoughtful. "I've never seen it that way," she replied. "Revenge is about inflicting pain. This was about correcting the record. William built an empire, it's true, but he built it on a foundation we laid together. When he tried to erase my part of that story, he destabilized the entire structure. It was bound to collapse. The prenup was just the first crack to show." Do you have any advice for people who find themselves in a similar position feeling powerless against someone with all the resources. Jessica looked out the window, a quiet strength radiating from her. Power isn't just about money or status. Real power is the truth. It can be buried, ignored, and hidden away in a box for 20 years, but it doesn't decay. It waits. My advice is to find your truth, hold on to it, and never be afraid to bring it into the light. You never know whose signature might be on it. She left the cafe and walked into the bustling New York streets, no longer a ghost in a grey dress, but a woman entirely of her own, making the architect of a legacy that was finally and indisputably hers. 7 years passed. In the fast-moving world of technology and finance, 7 years can be a lifetime. William Beaumont's spectacular fall was now a footnote in business history, a case study for ethics classes at Wharton and Stanford. Nexus Dynamics, under its new leadership and the quiet guidance of Jessica's Nexus project, had become a paradigm of corporate responsibility, its stock price more robust and stable than ever before. Jessica Peterson was no longer defined by her divorce. She had become a titan in her own right, but of a different sort. Peterson Partners was one of the most successful and respected venture capital firms in the country, known for its shrewd investments and its unwavering commitment to ethical, sustainable growth. The women she had mentored were now CEOs and innovators, creating a powerful network that was changing the landscape of the tech industry. Her children, Matthew and Sophie, were thriving in college, having navigated the storm of their family's past with a maturity that made her proud. They had a strained but civil relationship with their father, built on carefully managed visits and brief phone calls. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Jessica was in her corner office, overlooking the city, reviewing a pitch for a groundbreaking biotech company. Her assistant buzzed through on the intercom. "Jessica, a letter arrived for you by courier. It's personal." A long, thin envelope lay on her desk. There was no return address, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was shakier now, stripped of its former confidence, but it was unmistakably William's. He had been released from prison 3 months ago on parole for good behavior. She knew this day might come, but she had never been sure what form it would take. With steady hands, she opened the letter. It was a single page written on plain-lined paper. "Jessica, they don't teach you much in prison that is useful on the outside, but they do give you one thing in abundance: time to think. I have had almost a decade of it. For most of that time, I thought about what I lost: the company, the money, the reputation. I spent years blaming you, the lawyers, the judge, anyone but myself. It was only in the last year that I started to think about what I really lost. I lost that night in Palo Alto. I lost the person who believed in my chaotic ideas before they were worth a dime. The partner who designed the logo on a second-hand laptop and used her savings to pay for our groceries. I read an article about Peterson Partners last month. It said your guiding principle is investing in the foundation. I had to laugh, though it was a bitter one. You always understood that. I'm the one who forgot that a skyscraper is worthless if it's built on a rotten foundation. What I did to you was more than just a betrayal. It was an erasure. I tried to erase you from our story because my ego couldn't handle the truth that I would have been nothing without you. That is a fact. The court proved it legally, but it took me years of silence and solitude to understand it fundamentally. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. And I am not asking for anything at all. I just needed to correct the record myself without lawyers or judges. You were the co-founder. It was our company. I hope you are well. Will Jessica read the letter twice? There was no surge of anger, no wave of pity. Instead, a profound sense of quiet settled over her. This was it, the final missing piece. It wasn't an apology crafted to manipulate her. It was a confession, a stark acknowledgement of the truth she had fought so hard for. She walked over to the wall behind her desk. Hanging there in a simple, elegant frame was not a piece of expensive art, but the yellowed handwritten prenup from 2005. It had become a founding document for her new life, a reminder that a promise made with integrity holds more weight than any corporate contract. She looked at his youthful signature, then back at the letter in her hand. The two signatures told the entire story, one of a young man full of dreams, the other of a broken man who had finally understood their cost. She didn't need to write back. Her success, her peace, the empire of integrity she had built, that was her response. Placing the letter in a drawer, she turned back to the window. The rain had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds, casting a brilliant light over the city skyline. She was not the wife of a billionaire, nor the victor in a bitter divorce. She was Jessica Peterson, a founder, a builder, an architect of her own incredible future. The record was finally and completely corrected, and her story was still being written. And so the story of Jessica Beaumont isn't just a tale of a dramatic courtroom battle. It's a powerful reminder that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's been buried. It shows us that integrity is the most valuable asset, and that true strength isn't about how loudly you shout, but about the quiet conviction you hold when you know you are right. A single sheet of paper, a forgotten promise, held more power than billions of dollars because it was built on a foundation of truth. Jessica didn't just win a settlement. She reclaimed her history and her identity. If this story of justice, resilience, and the quiet power of truth resonated with you, please take a moment to hit the like button below. Share this video with someone who might need to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will leave you thinking long after they're over. Thank you for listening.